Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Sustainable Commodities podcast, a podcast to help people navigate the ever-changing world of sustainability and sustainable commodities. I'm Barnaby Patchett, MD of 199 Agency, a marketing agency working in sustainability, and with me is my co-host,
Judith Murdoch of Murdoch Associates, working in forest risk commodities.
And in this episode, we're joined by Leah Sandberg. Leah is the lead scientist for the Accountability Framework Initiative, a program of the Rainforest Alliance. I think Leah's LinkedIn profile probably has the best description of her role, which is figuring out how to feed everyone without trashing the place. The Rainforest Alliance, of course, is an international non-profit organisation that's building an alliance to protect forests, improve the livelihoods of farmers and forest communities, promote their human rights, and help them mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis.
So, Leah, can you just tell us a little bit about what you do at Rainforest Alliance?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a lead scientist at the Rainforest Alliance, which as an organization works in all kinds of spaces with farmers, with companies, with communities, working on sustainable production. There's a large focus, I think, as everyone knows, on certification of sustainable farms, of sustainable cooperatives, and working with companies to source those products. My work is largely focused around the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is a coalition of 25 civil society organizations which work together to support companies in eliminating deforestation, conversion of other ecosystems, and associated human rights impacts from agricultural and forestry supply chains. So I hope to lead that initiative together with a lot of my colleagues. And together we publish consensus-based guidance, which includes the Accountability Framework itself, which lays out principles and best practice for responsible supply chains and many other tools and resources. So the Accountability Framework was first published in 2019, and since then has become the gold standard for corporate and industry association no deforestation and no conversion policies, as well as reporting standards. And we work together with all of our partners to facilitate alignment on commodity-driven deforestation across all of a company's stakeholders, from NGOs to investors to buyers to policymakers.
One question that jumps out is deforestation and conversion. What are your definitions of those two?
Absolutely. Always a hot topic with the definitions. So we really focus on the conversion of natural ecosystems into agricultural ecosystems. So for deforestation, that's, I think, aligned with what many people would think of it. If you have a natural forest, if it's behaving like a natural forest, even if it's a managed one, even if there's silviculture going on, it can still be a natural forest. And that's converted into something which is not providing the structure and function of that forest, whether that is row crop agriculture or whether it is a exotic tree plantation. That would all be considered deforestation of that forest. Similarly, for non-forest ecosystems, really focus on, is this a natural ecosystem that's providing the ecological functions of that natural ecosystem, again, even if it's managed. So you can have natural grasslands that are grazed, that are still natural, and if you converted that into a soy plantation, it would be considered conversion. So we look and say, for any given commodity, what are the ecosystems that are sort of most threatened by this commodity, and how do we protect them, regardless of whether it's a forest, a savanna, a grassland, et cetera.
Great. Talking about deforestation and conversion-free supply chains, in May this year, you released a report, Time for Transparency, Deforestation and Conversion-Free Supply Chains. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our new report, we did publish together with CDP, which is a major reporting and disclosure platform. And we looked at the disclosures made via the CDP Forest Questionnaire in 2013. In 2023. And it gives us really the first quantitative look at how companies are progressing on the path to achieving deforestation and conversion-free supply chains using standardized metrics developed by the Accountability Framework Initiative, CDP, and other partners. So it really allows us kind of our first view of the methods and approaches that companies are actually using to identify and avoid deforestation in agricultural and forestry commodity production and trade.
Great. What did you find out?
Absolutely. So, to back up, we looked at responses from 881 companies that disclosed on one or more high-risk commodities, which added up to almost 1,500 commodity-specific disclosures across 7 different commodities. The largest share of disclosures were for timber products, followed by palm oil, soy, and cattle products, with coffee, cocoa, and other things making up a smaller share of the disclosures. So the first thing we really wanted to know is, did companies disclose? We worked with CDP to put these standardized indicators regarding how deforestation and conversion-free are your supply chains. We developed those indicators together with them. We put them into the questionnaire. We told companies they should answer them. The AFI put out and asked companies to respond to those questions, as did CDP. So the first question was, did they answer questions about how deforestation-free are their supply chains? So we found that of the 881 companies that disclosed on at least one commodity, 445, or about half of them, answered questions about the percent of their supply chains that were deforestation and conversion-free for at least one commodity. We also found that only 186 of those, or about a fifth of companies, provided sufficient information and justification to support credible DCF claims. So, we're seeing in a space where about half of the companies answered the question, about a fifth of the company answered the question in a way that was easily interpretable by stakeholders. So it's happening, but there's definitely room to grow. It's kind of the big picture.
A long way to go, I guess.
Yeah. Were you disappointed with that result?
I was not disappointed. I think we were not disappointed. I think it was about where we would expect to come in based on who we're talking to. I think that this question of what percent DCF is your supply chain is very specific. And it's somewhat new. In the past, companies have been more asked about, do you have a deforestation-free policy? Things like that. So I think really sort of saying, what is the number is new, and it's a little intimidating because a lot of companies feel that there's risk to answering that, and there might be very well to them risk to answering that. So, I think sort of trying to normalize this, which is what we're really doing here, saying, we're going to normalize eventually quite soon, everyone is going to have to know how much deforestation is in your supply chain, whether that's because of regulation that's coming, whether that's because of climate targets. So I think really trying to normalize disclosing on these topics is where we're at. We also gained a huge amount of information about how companies are doing this and where they are on their journey.
And who did you ask? What type of businesses were you asking? You have a feel for, was it consumer goods manufacturers or?
Yeah, so this is all the companies that responded to CDP Forest, which is definitely skewed towards consumer good manufacturers. Let's see if I actually have the numbers here. But let's see. Yeah, about 60% of disclosing companies were in manufacturing, about 13% were producers. Some retailers, some primary processors and things like that along the way. But it's about 60% consumer goods companies who have been, very engaged on this all along.
So you've got a baseline, I guess, in terms of the data. What can the companies do now to bridge the gap, I guess, when it comes to achieving deforestation and conversion-free supply chains?
Absolutely. So, one of the things we wanted to know, in addition to what percent DCF is your supply chain, deforestation and conversion-free is your supply chain, is how do you know? What methods do you use to actually try to get to DCF in your supply chain? What we found was that nearly all companies use quite a variety of different approaches. And in many cases, those approaches were overlaid on top of one another. So at least half of the disclosures indicated the use of certification for at least some amount of DCF volumes. About a third indicated that they were getting defree material from sourcing areas with sort of no deforestation risk. And about a quarter indicated that these volumes were verified through direct monitoring of production units, such as farms and plantation. These proportions really varied by commodity. So, for example, companies were the most likely to use certification for timber and the most likely to rely on low-risk sourcing areas for cattle. But this really gives us a much better picture of how companies are working to achieve these goals. One thing we did find was that in many cases, these approaches were not used appropriately or were not well explained, which is how you kind of get to that 1/5 number. So a really big finding for us is there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of confusion of what they can actually do, what kind of assurance they provide. I think a lot of leading companies in the space do have a lot of expertise, do work closely with these tool providers, with these certification and standard providers to make sure that they understand what they do and don't provide and how they can be used appropriately. And that's really where we're seeing sort of a lot of needs for companies who need to like move forward and advance in this space.
And do you think it's companies that have got large turnovers with huge resources of staff that can answer these questions? And what happens with the companies that are smaller with less resource?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think with all of this, there's certainly a sort of I would say kind of a trickle down effect where, if these leading companies, which need to be leading, and in many cases they are working with these sort of tool providers, broadly speaking, whether that's certification providers, whether that's monitoring tools and providers, working with those companies to develop solutions that are appropriate and to make those solutions open access, which we work with as well. I think really sort of saying as the space advances, they'll become more and more available and interpretable to smaller companies with less resources, which is, we've seen already in some of the more advanced commodity spaces. For example, 64 companies that responded to CDP actually had 100% deforestation or conversion-free supply chains for at least one supply chain, and about half of those were in timber. And one of the reasons for that is because FSC certification is widely available and provides credible and and widespread assurance of deforestation-free products. And that can be accessed by companies of a range of sizes and scales. So, can solutions in other commodities be made that available is really the question.
I'd be interested, just from our background, how did palm stack up to timber?
Palm oil was interesting. So about 15% of disclosures for palm oil showed that they were 100% DCF. Mm-hmm. Where palm really stood out is they had an incredibly high percentage indicating that they were between 20 and 90% D-free, much higher than anybody else. Most of the commodities were down in kind of 5 to 10%. We're in that wide range, middle range. And what's really saying is that what we really saw is that these commodities that were disclosing on palm oil were much more comfortable with this question. We're really able to disclose their D-free percentage across a much wider range. It wasn't just sort of the leading companies that are 100% D-free are the only ones who can answer them. It was sort of companies across the board were able to, with confidence, say, this is what percent D-free my supply chain is. Mm-hmm. So that's really where we saw palm oil in the lead, was just companies willing to disclose regardless of what their actual percentage was.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. And do you think it's because RSPO is so dominant within that palm oil space?
I think a lot of it is RSPO, although there certainly was a lot of confusion in the responses companies gave about how different RSPO chain of custody models could be used to make these claims. So I think there's certainly some clarification that needs to happen for how companies should be using RSPO. But I think also it's just sort of the D-free conversation is more advanced in palm oil. There's tools, there's groups like the Palm Oil Collaboration Group. There's tools like the Implementation Reporting Framework where companies are comfortable reporting this in terms of percentages already. So I think that there's just sort of more advancement in the understanding of how these supply chains can be quantified in this way there.
So looking from the best to the worst, or the most transparent, to the least transparent, where's the least transparency? Which commodities is that in?
I mean, it's, to some extent, it's the first question is, well, which companies are actually disclosing to CDP, which is sort of the first, question about transparency. And they were really seeing timber and palm far out ahead, and followed by soy and cattle. So, and as you might imagine, timber companies that have timber and palm oil supply chains are far more advanced in a number of these ways than in other commodities. There's more certification available. It's more clear cut in terms of what type of ecosystems are involved. Palm oil and timber are very largely focused on deforestation of natural forests, mostly primary natural forests, for which there is good data. Open access data from Global Forest Watch and others. There's a good understanding of what's happening. Whereas for soy and cattle, it's there's still a lot more contestation in the space of which ecosystems should actually be protected from conversion, for example, which is the space we're working in at the AFI quite a lot right now, is to harmonize data, products, and monitoring tools around non-forest conversion for those products. But it's still it's a sort of a newer space. So I think the question of transparency is also just wrapped up in what are companies comfortable in being able to measure and monitor.
Guess that's going to depend also on where they're trading. That kind of brings us quite nicely onto the upcoming deforestation legislation, especially in the EU with EUDR.
Absolutely. So we get questions quite a bit about the EUDR right now. It's obviously front of mind for most of our partners and the companies we work with. One thing we can say pretty confidently is that following the principles and guidance of the accountability framework will set a company up to achieve a deforestation-free supply chain, which will allow them to be EUDR compliant regardless of kind of the minutiae and details of the rules that are still being developed for EUDR. So, I think following the guidance of the AFI around how do you set a commitment, how do you manage your supply chain to be able to understand your progress relative to that commitment, how do you monitor deforestation in in your sourcing areas, in the production units in your supply chain, that all sets you up to be EUDR compliant and compliant with other emerging regulations in the UK and elsewhere. So that's I think really the first thing to think about here. I think one of the things that we're very engaged in right now is that the EU is considering other ecosystems, other wooded lands, which are basically sort of savannas, and other natural ecosystems, which sort of are basically grasslands, in whether they're going to be adding that into legislation. We're working very hard right now to provide the consultants who are working on that project with sort of best available data on monitoring and measuring conversion in these non-forest ecosystems. So whether or not those are actually added into EUDR, I think we're trying to continue to provide guidance to companies on how they should be protecting those ecosystems as well. And I just would note that the definitions around sort of what is deforestation that are in the EUDR are fully aligned with what's on the accountability framework. So there's not any confusion there, really.
And how do you feel about smallholders and their inclusion in this legislation or exclusion?
Absolutely. So, a lot of the principles of the accountability framework are really designed to support smallholder inclusion in supply chains. So we have, a whole separate piece of guidance around how you can sort of nuance all of our other guidance and principles for smallholder supply chains to support inclusion. A lot of those are around trying to really work with and assess smallholder compliance at the level of a farmer group or of a cooperative, really trying to sort of look at metrics of are smallholders well managed? Do they have systems in place themselves to understand what's being asked of them by companies and to organize internally to provide compliant material? So it's really around supply chain management and sort of understanding what compliance looks like in that space. I think as far as the EUDR is concerned, the very stringent traceability and geolocation requirements do provide sort of an extra level of difficulty in these spaces. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just sort of working with companies to see how quickly they can be advancing those traceability tools and working with sort of tool providers to sort of say what's possible in terms of providing geolocation information. That's really the real crux with the EUDR and the smallholders, I think, are the geolocation requirements.
Yeah. And do you think that geolocation data is helpful? Is it going to change things?
I think in many cases it's incredibly helpful. I think one thing we're seeing in a lot of the data, for example, in our report, is that a lot of the things that companies are doing to sort of avoid having to get to farm level traceability are not actually effective or aren't actually something that they can understand whether or not they're actually providing deep reassurance. So I think in many cases, needing to do that traceability work of actually understanding which farms they're sourcing from is going to be essential to actually get a deforestation-free supply chain. Is that true in all cases? I actually think probably not. And I think in some cases, having some more sort of nuance around that would probably be beneficial. But in most cases, I would say that actually that companies are needing more traceability in order to understand what's in their supply chains. So by and large, I think it's all to the good.
Yeah. Great. So sort of outside, going beyond EUDR, obviously the EU is only one market. What about kind of possible UK and US legislation? I know we've got some looming in the pipeline, depending on how things go politically in your country.
Yeah, I don't really want to talk about that right now. But I just lost it. Yeah, I mean, so, even within the EU, as well as with other pending legislations in the UK and the US, I think there's more questions and answers in a lot of ways in terms of what the details of these policies will be. I think that they're coming in some form or another. The details will be eventually hammered out in some form or another. Companies will likely even really be ahead of where most of these legislations are by the time they hit the ground, because leading companies are having to do this stuff anyway for their climate targets, for their nature targets. I think this is really where we come back to focusing on the accountability framework, because the AFI is a full supply chain approach. It's not saying this is what you need to do for the volumes that you're selling to EUDR, to the EU market, and this is what you need to do for the volumes you're selling to the US market. It's sort of say this is how you craft a deforestation and conversion free supply chain that is robust and that can hold up over time. So, it's really, I think it's really easy to get lost in the details of all this legislation, including as well as all the details of, for example, carbon accounting. I think there's a lot of rabbit holes with all of this, but I think going back to some of the basics of how do you understand where your material is coming from? How do you understand whether or not that is associated with land use change, and how do you measure it across all of the volumes in your supply chain is going to set companies up for success, regardless of what the details of all these legislation ends up being.
So you'd hope that people would follow your AFI, and then they'd pretty much be covered.
It's not quite that simple, but yes, I mean, I think that there is
hope.
A lot of ability to get lost in some of these details when, the work of, I mean, it sounds simple when you put it that way, but the work of building a deforestation and conversion free supply chain is really hard. Huge companies with lots of resources that are really trying to do this are struggling. So it's not that it's just you do it and then you're done with it. But I think trying to follow the principles of the framework, which are really quite broad, which really say, start from first principles. How do you understand what you're buying? How do you understand where it's coming from? How do you understand whether that's associated with conversion? Can you do that for all of the materials in your supply chain? Can you do that in collaboration with your peers? That's going to get you where you need to go. So I think following that roadmap is going to get you where you need to go, regardless of what all of these details end up being.
Yeah. We promised we wouldn't ask you any difficult questions, so I hope this one doesn't come across as difficult. But I know that your expertise is not in certification, so I'm not going to stray into that. But one of the things that you have within certification is the way that an auditor will come in and look at a set piece of, a business, and then, the next person in the chain is certified. How does the accountability framework allow information to be passed down a complex supply chain, such as oleochemicals, into something like a shampoo?
Absolutely. So again, this is where the accountability framework really kind of operates from first principles, which is how do you know what is in your supply chain and where it comes from and what attributes are associated with that material? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Certification is a great way to do that. It is designed to attach attributes to products and to follow those products through the supply chain. We're big fans of certification, both at RA, obviously, and, throughout the work of the AFI, and again, we see in this report that the companies that are best able to achieve a D-free supply chain right now are those using certification in sectors where the certification is broadly available. However, in many sectors, certification is not there yet as a tool to do that. So the question becomes, where it's not available at sufficient scale or in sufficient chain of custody models to provide that assurance, what else is possible? What other methods of providing that assurance and providing that information of the supply chain are possible? And that can be done outside of certification. It can be done by passing information through, business to business disclosure. It can be done by buyers having geolocation information and monitoring their sourcing areas directly. There's a range of ways that this can happen outside of the auditing process of certification. And I think that again, as these questions around land use change are normalized because of regulation, because of climate accounting, et cetera, there are going to be additional verification options that arise outside of certification that provide verification through other mechanisms. I don't know what they are yet, but I know a lot of people are working on that. So I think, that is really a big piece of the puzzle, is what tools can provide sort of more out of the box solutions in these complex supply chains.
Okay. Yeah. And with the accountability framework, if someone was saying, listening to this, we'd like to potentially try to use this, how would they get started with the actual framework?
Absolutely. Well, everything that we have is open access. So you can go to accountabilityframework.org, check it out. The framework is there. We have a whole lot of explainers and resources. We also have lots of options to contact us directly. We are really, really happy to work directly with users to make sure that they have everything they need, and to connect with, there's 25 organizations in our coalition, many of whom work directly with companies in service provider roles, et cetera. So, we work really hard to sort of match companies and other organizations with the sort of organizations that are most able to help them with their specific needs. So we provide that service quite a bit. So definitely take a look at our material and reach out to us, and that's what we do.
Yeah. So if the will is there, the tools are there to support them.
Really, there are. I mean, we're sort of building the bicycle as we're riding it, as you say, but we're all working really hard on that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that brings us quite nicely to an end, actually. So, thank you for joining us on the Sustainable Commodities podcast, and join us next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. This was great.